I am innocent as a lamb. I never did witchcraft in my life. Elizabeth Proctor. Salem, Mass., 1692. From June through September of 1692, 19 men and women, all having been convicted of witchcraft, were carted to Gallows Hill for hanging. Another man, Giles Corey, who was over 80 years old, was pressed to death under heavy stones for refusing to submit to a trial on witchcraft charges. Hundreds of others faced accusations of witchcraft. Dozens were held in jail for months without trials. Then, almost as soon as it had begun, the hysteria that swept through Puritan Massachusetts ended. So what caused these tragic deaths? An unfortunate combination of an ongoing frontier land war, economic or money problems, battle over the control of the church, teenage boredom, and personal jealousies can account for the spiraling accusations, trials, and executions that occurred in the spring and summer of 1692. In 1688, John Putnam, one of the most influential men of Salem village, invited Samuel Parris, who had been working in Barbados, a small island in the Caribbean, to be the minister at Salem Village Church. After negotiating a high salary, Parris accepted the job as village minister. He moved to Salem Village with his wife Elizabeth, his 16-year-old daughter Betty, niece Abigail Williams, and his Indian slave from Barbados, Tituba. Salem was in the midst of change. Although John Putnam had appointed Parris as the village minister, the Putnams and the Porters were fighting for control of the church. A debate was also raging over how independent Salem Village, tied more to the interior farming areas, should be separated from Salem City, a center of sea trade. By 1692, another Indian war had started, with a series of raids by the Wabanaki and their French allies. The war had moved to within 50 miles of Salem. In February of 1692, Betty Parris, age 16, became strangely ill. She dashed about, dove under furniture, contorted in pain, barked like a dog, fell dumb, babbled nonsensically, and complained of fever. She even threw a Bible across a room. The cause of her symptoms may have been some combination of physical and mental health issues. Other girls Betty knew began to exhibit similar symptoms. Her cousin, Abigail Williams, tried to jump in the air and fly. 11-year-old Ann Putnam and two 17-year-olds, Mercy Lewis and Mary Walcott, began to exhibit highly unusual behavior as well. Cotton Mather, who later would become a prominent figure in the Salem witch trials, had recently published a book, Memorable Providences, describing the suspected witchcraft of an Irish woman in Boston, and Betty's behavior in some ways mirrored that of the Irishwoman's. Dr. William Griggs was called in to examine the girls. When he couldn't find the cause of their behaviors, he suggested that the girls' problems might be supernatural. The widespread belief that witches targeted children made the doctor's diagnosis seem likely. A neighbor, Mary Sibley, proposed a form of counter magic. Sibley told John, the Parris family's Indian slave and Tituba's husband, to bake a rye cake containing Betty's and Abigail's urine and to feed the cake to the family dog. Animals were believed to be used by witches as agents to carry out their devilish commands. They thought the cake could draw the witch to the animal, perhaps even transfer the witch's spell to it. This backfired as Reverend Parris was outraged and called it going to the devil for help against the devil. By late February, 12-year-old Ann Putnam and Elizabeth Hubbard, a 16-year-old niece of Dr. Griggs, were also choking, shuddering, and showing other signs of being affected by witchcraft. Thomas Putnam begged his daughter to identify who might be responsible for her odd behavior. She supplied 3 names. The sheriff then arrested Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba on charges of witchcraft. Tituba was an obvious choice, likely named because of her practice of sharing with the girls tales of omens, voodoo, and witchcraft from her native folklore. Good was a beggar and social misfit who lived wherever someone would house her, and Osborne was old, quarrelsome, and had not attended church for over a year. The Putnams brought their complaint against the 3 women to Judges Jonathan Corwin and John Hathorne, who ordered the suspected witches to appear the next morning, March 1st, in Ingersoll's Tavern. When hundreds showed up, the examinations were moved to the meeting house. After an opening prayer, Judge John Hathorne wasted no time in getting down to business. "Sarah Good," he asked, "what evil spirit do you have familiarity with?" At the trials, the girls claimed they were being attacked by the ghosts of the 3 women and began to contort or bend their bodies in the presence of the accused women. The consistency of the 2 girls' accusations suggests strongly that the girls worked out their stories together. Ann Putnam and Mercy Lewis were also reporting seeing witches flying through the winter mist. Other villagers came forward to offer stories of cheese and butter mysteriously gone bad, or animals born with deformities after visits by one of the suspects. The judges asked the same questions of each suspect over and over. Were they witches? Had they seen Satan? How, if they were not witches, did they explain how the girls were acting in their presence? The style and form of the questions indicates that the judges thought the women guilty. Another girl in the village, Susanna Sheldon, also became an accuser. Beyond bending their bodies in pain, the girls also would fall down, freeze as if they couldn't move, and complained of biting and pinching sensations. In a village where everyone believed that the devil was real and acted in the real world, the girls' stories appeared credible. After first claiming to be innocent, Tituba, possibly afraid perhaps of being made a scapegoat, claimed that she was approached by a tall man from Boston, obviously Satan, who asked her to sign in his book and to do his work. Yes, Tituba declared she was a witch, and that she and 4 other witches, including Good and Osborne, had flown through the air on their broomsticks. She said that she had tried to run to Reverend Paris for help, but that the devil had blocked her path. Soon, according to their own reports, the spectral forms, or spirit forms, or ghosts, of other women began attacking the afflicted girls. Martha Corey, Rebecca Nurse, Sarah Cloyce, and Mary Easty were accused of witchcraft. And soon after, more accusers stepped forward, and so more people were arrested on charges of witchcraft. Suspects who were stuck in jail began to see confession as a way to avoid being hanged. Deliverance Hobbs became the second witch to confess, admitting to pinching 3 of the girls at the devil's command and flying on a broomstick to attend a witch's Sabbath or religious gathering in an open field. Jails were full, and the people of Salem were obsessed with the idea of witchcraft. When Governor Phips returned from England, he took action. Phips created a new court, the Court of Oyer and Terminier, to hear the witchcraft cases. 5 judges were appointed to the court, one being Chief Justice William Stoughton. Cotton Mather urged Stoughton and the other judges to credit confessions and admit spectral evidence, testimony by afflicted persons that they had been visited by a suspect specter, meaning spirit or ghost. Judges who had no legal training on matters of witchcraft were going to religious leaders for help. The judges soon began to allow the touching test. where defendants were asked to touch afflicted persons to see if their touch would stop their symptoms. They also allowed the examination of the accused witches for evidence of witches' marks, moles where a witch's familiar animal might suck. Evidence that would be excluded from modern courtrooms, hearsay, gossips, stories, unsupported claims, and guesses were also generally allowed. Many protections that modern defendants take for granted were lacking in Salem. Accused witches had no legal counsel, could not have witnesses testify under oath on their behalf, and had no formal avenues of appeal. Defendants could, however, speak for themselves, produce evidence, and cross-examine their accusers. The first accused witch to be brought to trial was Bridget Bishop. Almost 60 years old, owner of a tavern where patrons could drink cider ale and play shuffleboard even on holy days. Critical of her neighbors and reluctant to pay her bills, Bishop was a prime candidate for an accusation of witchcraft. At Bishop's trial on June 2nd, a farm worker testified that he saw Bishop's image stealing eggs and then saw her transform herself into a cat. Deliverance Hobbs, by then probably insane, and Mary Warren, both confessed witches, testified that Bishop was one of them. A villager named Samuel Gray told the court that Bishop visited his bed at night and tormented him. Several of the afflicted girls testified that Bishop's specter or ghost afflicted them also. Numerous other villagers described why they thought Bishop was responsible for various bits of bad luck that had befallen them. There was even testimony that while being transported under guard past the Salem meeting house, she looked at the building and caused a part of it to fall to the ground. Bishop's jury returned a verdict of guilty. One of the judges, Nathaniel Saltonstall, aghast at the conduct of the trial, resigned from the court. Chief Justice Stoughton signed Bishop's death warrant, and on June 10, 1692, Bishop was carted to Gallows Hill and hanged, the first victim of the Salem trials. After the death of Bridget Bishop, the pace of the trials picked up. Rebecca Nurse, a well-known, respected woman of the church, was accused by Ann Putnam Jr. and Abigail Williams. They claimed that Nurse's specter, spirit form, had attacked them. Ann Putnam Sr. added her complaint that Nurse demanded that she sign the devil's book, then pinched her. Nurse was one of the 3 town sisters, all identified as witches, who were members of a Topsfield family that had a long-standing quarrel with the Putnam family. One major piece of evidence against Nurse appeared to be testimony indicating that after Nurse lectured Benjamin Holton for allowing his pig to root in her garden, Holton died. The Nurse jury returned a verdict of not guilty, much to the displeasure of Chief Justice Stoughton, who told the jury to go back and consider again a statement of Nurse's that might be considered an admission of guilt. The jury reconvened, this time coming back with a verdict of guilty. On July 19, 1692, Nurse rode with 4 other convicted witches to Gallows Hill. Persons who didn't believe the accusations of witchcraft risked becoming targets themselves. One man who was openly critical of the trials paid for his disbelief with his life. John Proctor was an opinionated tavern owner who openly denounced the witch hunt. Testifying against Proctor were Ann Putnam, Abigail Williams, Indian John, and Elizabeth Booth, who testified that ghosts had come to her and accused Proctor of serial murder. Proctor fought back as best he could, accusing confessed witches of lying, complaining of torture, and demanding that his trial be moved to Boston. He was denied his request, and Proctor was hanged. His wife Elizabeth, who was also convicted of witchcraft, was spared execution because of her pregnancy. reprieved for the belly. No execution caused more unease in Salem than that of the village's ex-minister George Burroughs. Burroughs, who was living in Maine in 1692, was identified by several of his accusers as the ringleader of the witches. Ann Putnam claimed that Burroughs bewitched soldiers during a failed military campaign against the Wabanakis in 1688 through 89, the first of a string of military disasters that could be blamed on an Indian Devil alliance. Among the 30 accusers of Burroughs was 19-year-old Mercy Lewis. Lewis, the most imaginative and forceful of the young accusers, offered unusually vivid testimony against Burroughs. Lewis told the court that Burroughs flew her to the top of a mountain and, pointing toward the surrounding land, promised her all the kingdoms if only she would sign in his book. A story very similar to that found in Matthew in the Bible. At an execution, a defendant in the Puritan colonies was expected to confess to save his soul. When Burroughs on Gallows Hill continued to insist on his innocence and then recited the Lord's Prayer perfectly, something witches were thought incapable of doing, the crowd reportedly was greatly moved. The agitation of the crowd caused Cotton Mather to intervene and remind the crowd that Burroughs had had his day in court and lost. Giles Corey, who had spent 5 months in chains in a Salem jail with his accused wife, didn't see the point of a trial. He was hoping that by avoiding a conviction, his farm, that would otherwise go to the state, might go to his 2 sons-in-law. Corey refused to stand trial. The penalty for such a refusal was pressing. During his pressing, Giles Corey had heavy stones put on his chest, and when they asked him to confess, he continued to say, "More weight," knowing that when he was done and in the ground, that his land would then go to his 2 sons-in-law. 3 days after Corey's death on September 22, 1692, 8 more convicted witches, including Giles's wife Martha and my ancestor Margaret Scott, were hanged. They were the last victims of the witch hunt. By early autumn of 1692, Salem's lust for blood was coming to an end. Doubts were developing as to how so many respectable people could be guilty. The educated elite of the colony began efforts to end the witch hunting that had enveloped Salem. Increase Mather, the father of Cotton, published what has been called America's first tract on evidence, a work entitled Cases of Conscience, which argued that it were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than 1 innocent person should be condemned. Increase Mather urged the court to exclude spectral evidence. Samuel Willard, a highly regarded Boston minister, circulated some miscellany observations on our present debates respecting witchcraft, which suggested that the devil might create the specter, or spirit or ghost, of an innocent person. Mather's and Willard's works were given to Governor Phipps. The writings, along with Governor Phipps's wife being accused of witchcraft, most likely influenced his decision to order the court to exclude spectral evidence and touching tests, and to require proof of guilt by clear and convincing evidence. With spectral evidence not admitted, 28 of the last 33 witchcraft trials ended in acquittals. The 3 convicted witches were later pardoned. In May of 1693, Phipps released from prison all remaining accused or convicted witches. Salem's nightmare was over. By the time the witch hunt ended, 19 convicted witches were executed. At least 4 accused witches had died in prison, and 1 man, Giles Corey, had been pressed to death. About 1 to 200 other persons were arrested and imprisoned on witchcraft charges. 2 dogs were executed as suspected accomplices of witches. As a side note, Tituba took back her confession, an act that enraged Reverend Paris. In retaliation, Paris refused to pay the jailer's fee to get his slave out of prison. Tituba spent some 13 months in jail until an unknown person paid £7 for her release. Most of the accused lived to the south of and were generally better off financially than most of the accusers. In a number of cases, accusing families stood to gain property from the convictions of the accused witches. Also, the accused and the accusers generally took opposite sides in a battle over the control of the church that had split the Salem community. While many of the accused witches supported former minister George Burroughs, the families that included the accusers had, for the most part, played leading roles in forcing Burroughs to leave Salem. The conclusion that many scholars draw from these patterns is that property disputes and religious feuds played a major role in determining who lived and who died in 1692. Following the release of the surviving accused witches, Samuel Sewall, one of the judges, issued a public confession of guilt and an apology. Several jurors came forward to say that they were sadly deluded and mistaken in their judgments. Reverend Samuel Paris conceded errors of judgment, but mostly shifted blame to others. Paris was replaced as minister of Salem Village by Thomas Green, who devoted his career to putting his torn congregation back together. Governor Phipps blamed the entire affair on William Stoughton. Stoughton, clearly more to blame than anyone for the tragic episode, refused to apologize or explain himself. He criticized Phipps for interfering just when he was about to clear the land of witches. Stoughton became the next governor of Massachusetts. The witches disappeared, but witch hunting in America did not. Each generation must learn the lessons of history or risk repeating its mistakes. Salem should warn us to think hard about how to best safeguard and improve our system of justice.